A conversation with Ed Brodbent, leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada. Here is Bayton National Editor Tom Clark.
Good evening. Well, by any measure, these have been extraordinary times for the New Democrats. Despite finishing in third place in the last election, the personal popularity of Ed Brodbent has consistently rated first among the three leaders. And then, for one brief shining moment a year and a half ago, a new historical high. The NDP topped the voter preference polls for the first time ever. The numbers have since changed, but the legacy of that popularity has positioned the NDP, if not for a run at forming the government, certainly a run at being the official opposition. Never before in their history have their prospects looked so bright. And for the first time, many Canadians are taking an interest in the NDP and what they stand for. A conversation with NDP leader Ed Brodbent in just 1 minute. Mr. Brodbent, first of all, good evening and thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
This really has been, as I said at the beginning, an extraordinary time for you and your party over the past 3 or 4 years. At one point you topped the polls. Your personal popularity is consistently high. What's interesting about this popularity has happened at a time when the economy has performed well, has improved significantly, and unemployment and inflation down significantly. Why do you think all this has happened for you now?
Oh, I think many things come together. First of all, the people of Canada have, I think, respected a certain ongoing consistency about the New Democratic Party. If I had to guess, a good part of this got established in a different group of Canadians' minds, if I can put it that way, partway through the 1984 election. I think a lot of people, by the end of the 84 campaign, who didn't vote for us, came very close to doing so. And they started looking at what we talked about in terms of tax reform, concerns about the environment, doing something about equality between the sexes. And I think perhaps, for the first time, a number of them thought, well, these are perhaps pretty reasonable ideas. We've never voted for the NDP before, but they're sort of reasonable. And then, since 1984, we have been quite persistent on these themes, if you like, of doing what I profoundly believe in. If I had to simplify somewhat, say why I went into politics many years ago and took a commitment to my party, is to really use political power and influence as a priority to bring benefits to the average family. That should be the goal. And every policy decision you make ought to be put in that frame. How does that affect the ordinary guy, the ordinary woman in this country? Well, we've done that, I think, persistently through the 84 to 88 period with Mr. Mulroney. And, of course, when people start coming to you, they are inevitably responding to the failures of the government. People don't just come out of the blue. They have to be unhappy with the government of the day before they start looking at either opposition party. So Mr. Mulroney built up a lot of expectations in 1984, in fact, on a lot of these themes, more open government, fairer government, and so on. And then a lot of people, as you well know, became very disappointed, particularly for 3.5 years through that government. And I think they looked at us and said, well, gee, those guys and women kind of make sense. Let's give them a go.
You know, let's take a look at your own personal popularity and how that's translating into this campaign. I think that one thing that a lot of people have noticed in the campaign ads and the signs is that this is very much a campaign that is centered on you. It's known as the Ed Brodbent team, and in your TV commercials, it's very much centered on you. I'm just wondering whether this, if I can call it a personality cult type of campaign, disturbs you at all. It's not a traditional NDP approach. I am ambivalent about it in one sense. That politics for me always has been, always will be, very much a matter of policy, program, how can we as a nation get together to make this country of ours, which is also supremely blessed by nature and by our people who have created historically a pretty good country. How can we make it better? So I've always thought of it in policy terms, and when one puts, if I can put it this way, the wrong kind of emphasis on personality, that
that doesn't appeal to me particularly. But if the leader is seen to be a symbol of what he or she is talking about for the party, i.e. you don't use a lot of gimmicks to demonstrate or draw attention to matters in the leader's personality that have absolutely nothing to do with what the party's all about. If you don't do those things, then it's fine. I believe, for example, that, you know, Tommy Douglas would never have become premier. That's an exaggeration. It is unlikely he would have become premier of Saskatchewan, the first social democratic premier in North America, if his own very real, charming, warm personality hadn't drawn people into thinking about what the party stood for. Or to get right outside of our country, Willy Brandt, who became the Chancellor of West Germany the first time for the Social Democratic Party there. I think Willy's own personality opened the door, perhaps, to some consideration, serious consideration of what his party stood for. Well, therefore, in that sense, if what I, Ed Brodbent, am talking about, as I was today on tax reform or about environmental matters, and people say, well, gee, that guy's kind of interesting on that, as long as what I'm talking about is my party's policy and program, and it causes further reflection on that, I'm quite happy.
Well, on that score, the critics of yours in this campaign have a slightly different answer to that question. They're saying that the reason that your campaign is focusing on yourself is because you personally are seen as a moderate, but that by putting you up front, that is masking a deeper radicalism within your own party. And in fact, the critics say, masking then what they call a hidden agenda.
You see, that really isn't so. If you look at not only our country, where Alan Blakeney, Howard Pauley, Dave Barrett in the past, Tony Pennicott now in the Yukon heads of government, these men, in one sense, are mainstream New Democrats. In every social democratic party, yes, indeed in every conservative party, you have a range of commitment and intensity of feeling about the philosophical priorities of the party, as I say, whatever the party is you're talking about. And almost inevitably, in my experience, the people who lead the party are sort of comfortably in the center or whatever, right? They're the mainstream of the party. And it's been true here and again in countries where we govern outside of here, the Prime Minister of Norway or Sweden or Spain or whatever. These men and women, I think, reflect the main direction of the party. I mean, if you look at what I'm saying in this campaign about taxes, about the environment, and the debate about the equality for women, all of these reflect views of policy positions taken by the party. They aren't Ed Brodbent's personal preferences.
Well, let's take a look at your policy, and if you don't mind, let's divide it up into what I would call the election agenda policy of the NDP, and then your other party policies. But let's start with what by common agreement is the preeminent issue in this debate, and that is free trade. Let's assume for a moment, for the sake of conversation, that on November the 21st, the voters return a minority government in Ottawa. Presumably under a scenario like that, you and the Liberals would prevent the passage of the free trade bill. You would let it die. What I'm interested in is what happens after that, the day after free trade is now dead. Do we carry on business as usual as if nothing had happened? What do we do?
Oh, we'd have to begin in a most serious way with our very good neighbor to the south of us, with whom we've had overwhelmingly good, constructive, commercial and other kinds of relationships throughout the history of our two countries. They know it. I've already, for example, spoken with the American ambassador. Like the other parties, we know him personally. He knows our position. He knows the government's position. He knows Mr. Turner and the Liberals' position. He knows our position. Leading American politicians, with whom I've also met, know our opposition to this deal. They know that the public of Canada roughly is equally divided, and it could go either way on this issue in the final outcome of the election. I clearly hope that it goes against, in a decisive way, the deal. So, you begin with that. Serious people on both sides of the party are aware. Democracy makes a decision. But so, we would not proceed with the deal, but we would obviously be looking for the continuation of what was already underway, reduction of tariffs between the two countries, which will facilitate greater commerce, that would not be interfered with. We would look probably for putting in place some kind of dispute settlement mechanism, which Steve Langdon, the trade critic for my party, I believe was the first publicly to talk about as being a desirable matter to reduce tensions between the two countries. We both have an interest in that. We might look at the feasibility of some other bilateral agreements comparable in principle to the Auto Pact. Aren't many sectors more where that would probably work as well, but that's the kind of thing we could look at. We would continue trade. And then as an independent nation, however, I would also say, we would be looking for expanding trade in the Pacific Rim countries, of making up for some of the lost markets that have occurred in Europe because this present government has put so much emphasis on the American connection. In other words, there would both be a continuity of past good trading relationships with some innovation that we clearly think would be advantageous to Canada, and if in some of the matters I've talked about, clearly would be advantageous to the U.S.
What about some of the comments, though, that we have heard from Washington, both in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and within the administration itself, that canceling this deal now would raise tensions between the two countries, that would create problems simply by not going ahead with this deal? How would you tackle that?
Well, a couple things. Of course, they're being sincere when they say that, but they have a vested interest in saying, well, look, there's something they really believe in. I think they should believe in it because they got by far the best of the deal in the energy sector and services. There's so many changes that are clearly advantageous to them that they want to keep constructive pressure on to keep it in place. But they're mature men and women. The people who supported it, and they did a lot of work in the Senate committees and so on in the American congressional system, would obviously prefer to continue to have the work that they did implemented. But they know, as well as we, that we are their best customer. It's not just a one-way thing. We not only need American markets, they need us. And I haven't any doubt that, yes, there would be some short-run wringing of hands and say, well, that conservative government that we were relying upon because they were doing what they wanted and what the Americans wanted, in my judgment, is out of office, and we now have to deal with the new arrangement. We would like it to be other. Obviously, if they've got what they think is a first-rate deal, and it's now going to go, they're going to be somewhat disappointed. But right away, the Americans, if a people is pragmatic, can be defined as pragmatic in the world in terms of business relations, it's surely the United States. And I think very quickly we would pick up from where we were before we got involved in this process. Let's move on to some of the other items on your agenda, but they're not necessarily getting a lot of attention so far in this campaign. I think that in all the major cities across this country, people are genuinely horrified at the sight of otherwise decent, honest people having to line up for food in this country. The question of poverty, not only in our major cities, but in some of our smaller cities as well. One of your policies is a guaranteed annual income. And without going through all the complicated mathematics, I've worked that out to be about $11,000 a year for a single able-bodied man. Just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that guaranteed annual income would work, how you'd implement it, and about the cost. It is just simply not a priority. That was a resolution that was passed a number of years ago. As having done your research, you would know that. The tradition of our party is a Social Democratic Party, and unlike the other parties in Canada who aren't involved in any democratic process whatsoever in establishing goals for the future, whether it's in pensions or in the environment or any other area by convention, we have those discussions where our people get together at the national level every 2 years, talk about right then what the priorities are, what they believe the new directions for Canada should be. Quite democratic, makes sense for me very much. But a resolution that may be passed at a convention at a given time remains part of what we call the policy book of the party. But a number of years later, you may have very different priorities that you have to deal with as a country, as we do now. You have a child care crisis of serious proportions. You have regional development obligations in this country of serious proportions. You have the need, and I say this candidly, politicians, including in my own party, have caught up with the population of Canada in a way on the environment. A real need to spend money there. You have simultaneously developed, in the case of low-income people, a priority in dealing with special aspects of poverty, income distribution, which the tax system plays a role in, and in housing, which we have had something to say about already, and we will be talking more about. And what we are saying in this context is this batch of, or combination of priorities in 1988, in terms of the spending commitments that we're involved in, is what we would do. So we're not talking about implementing a guaranteed annual income program now, as much as at some point in the future it might be appropriate. And I do want to make it clear, it's not that we have some hidden agenda, because I believe that very seriously. I think Mr. Mulroney can be accused of having a certain hidden agenda if we talk about free trade. If that was part of their policy, they never talked about it before 1984, and then they brought it in. But we are laying out what we would do over the next 4 years, so that if you look at our policy book that exists since 1961, it just would make no sense whatsoever to say some resolution that was passed just because it was in the book in 1962 or 63 is what is going to be applied between 1984 and 88.
But
I, as leader,
time.
well, it may or may not, but it would always be said. It would be made clear if it was going, when people are voting, and that's what I profoundly believe in. When people are voting now in 1988, we are laying out, and we're saying what things would cost, by the way, too, and I hope the other parties start doing that and saying who's going to pay for it, rich people or middle income. We're saying we would do, what it would cost during the next 4-year period. So there will be no hidden agendas.
Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this policy resolution thing, but I think it does give people an insight, perhaps, into the character of your party. But let's deal with perhaps a smaller issue, and that is the question of the minimum wage. It has always been your position, federally and in many of the provinces, that the minimum wage should be 60% of the average industrial wage. Again, going through the mathematics, that works out to be about $7 an hour. Is that something that you would implement in the next 4 years, an increase in the minimum wage to $7 an hour?
We are not committed to that policy of implementing that minimum wage over that period of time. What we will be doing about that as a priority item will be dealt with between now and the end of the election campaign.
So you will have more to say about the minimum wage?
Yes, because what we're saying, and I believe very profoundly in this, is that you develop a set of policies that are based on your program that would make this country fair in terms of the distribution of income burden particularly, fair in terms of jobs on a regional basis, healthier in terms of the environment, but you look at what the economy can afford at a given time, for as far as you can project it 4 years down the road, and then you make the tough decisions in terms of what all your program in principle wants you to do to lead to the conclusion to what you actually can do. And that's why I say we are spelling out a 4-year program in this campaign, so that by the time people vote in November 21st, they will know, if they have a copy of our resolution book, for example, what we really would be doing over that 4-year period of time.
Okay. Again, I just want to hit one more point before we leave this, and I think that as people are looking at the NDP perhaps for the first time and hearing about your party from your critics, that's one thing that stands out to a lot of people is the question of nationalization, because in many senses that is at the root and the soul of the social democratic movement. Most people know about the bank that you want to nationalize, and I won't go through the whole list of the other targets that you have in mind, but just let me give you a few examples, and perhaps you could respond to them. You want to nationalize the cable TV industry in this country. You want to nationalize the Canadian Pacific Railroad. You want to nationalize Imperial Oil, the aerospace industry, much of the resource industry, and there's many others. Now, I don't want to get hung up on this, but would you really do this? Is this the nature of your party to do this?
See, what these are perfect illustrations of is that the party is committed in an open way to a mixed economy. The other parties inadvertently, from time to time, stumble into public enterprise, but they aren't candid because they aren't. And this is the difference, I suppose. They aren't committed, as we are, in principle, to a mixed economy. So we don't hesitate, for example, as was done in the case a few years ago, when bank profits were at a record level and interest rates were at a post-World War II high in the early 80s. There's the bank public sector resolution that we passed that you referred to. But it's hardly, if I can put it in this context, a radical thing in Canada. It would be more so in the United States. If you look at our own traditions, conservatives and liberals, we have Air Canada, we have Petro-Canada, we have the CN railway system, we have in this business that we happen to be in a private network. We both know that the CBC plays a leading role in this country. We have health services in the public sector. We have a tradition, in fact, going back to John A. Macdonald, who started public sector, public money involvement in the railways, of public and private enterprise, totally different from the United States. Even in the banks, we have in the province of Ontario a public sector bank. We have in Alberta a public sector bank. So the position is something that is traditional in Canada, that I proudly say for most of the modern period, when we have moved into new public activity, whether with Petro-Canada or with Medicare, the NDP has been provided the impetus for it, provided institutions that people like, by the way, have found to be effective. But again, when you do that at any given time, as I've just said about other issues, we would be saying when and how much it would cost, and talking to the people of Canada in terms of its desirability of a given time. And I would say without exception, if you look at the recent innovations of the NDP in our country, Medicare, Tories and Liberals denounced it all over the place until it came in. And now they all defend it. Okay. Petro-Canada, the same way originally. Now it's in. They defend it, though the Tories are now trying to privatize it.
All right, but I just want to make sure, because we are running out of time here, that then these questions of nationalization on all these various areas and so on is something that is in the psyche of the NDP that we may see at some point down the road.
There are policy resolutions in the party book. I repeat, it goes back to 1961. It's like digging up the Old Testament and the New Testament in one sense, if you're a Christian and or Jew, depending on which part of the book you might be referring to. That's there. It's a resolution that we have, but in terms of the leadership of a party implementing its goals for fairness at a given time, in terms of all the things I've talked about, you can't simultaneously spend a few $1 billion on child care, which is a great priority, and do some of the things that you've just alluded to. And our priority is to make sure that child care is dealt with. And there would be no hidden agenda for the people of Canada. That is a clear thing, that any time that we are going to do something like this, move in an innovative way, structurally in the economy, unlike Mr. Mulroney on the trade deal, you can be sure we would be talking about it in advance so that the people of Canada would have ample time to say, as in the case of Medicare, for example, whether it was a good idea or not.
One thing that hasn't been talked about in this campaign at all so far is foreign policy, and I want to touch on it just very, very briefly. An NDP government, would you supply any sort of military aid, non-lethal military aid, to the frontline states in South Africa, to Nicaragua,
no,
or to any other places in the country?
Not military aid, not at all.
Non-lethal military aid?
No.
How would you then deal with the frontline states in terms of aid? I mean, we are not without influence in that area.
Well, we've talked about providing backup guarantees, additional funds. For example, the Scandinavian countries and the frontline states have, when they've made grants and assistance for development, knowing full well that because of military attacks generated from South Africa, the net effect of providing a few $1 million, say, for the building of a railway, will be to have a good part of it destroyed by military action. They add additional money so that the frontline state could buy their own military, through their own military soldiers, cover the protection for that railway.
Mr. Brodbent, I am sorry, sir, we're out of time, but I'd like to wish you the best of luck in the next 4 weeks ahead. Thank you very much for dropping by.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
This has been a conversation with Ed Brodbent, leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada. Next week at this time, a conversation with John Turner, leader of the Liberal Party of Canada.